Republicans still trying to pass their tax bill by the end of the year. We'll take a look at who wins and who loses in their plan, and also what happens if they fail again to pass something, even though they control the White House and both chambers of Congress. Then, if Republican Roy Moore actually wins the Senate seat in Alabama, and the polls actually say it could happen, could that cause even more trouble for the GOP? An accused child molester in the Senate could make things quite complicated on a whole lot of issues. Also, we all know the country is divided right now, but it might shock you just how divided we really are. We're going to show you how it starts at the top. I'm talking all the way to the White House. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to RFL. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Richard French. Now, the Senate version of the Republican tax bill, it has passed a key hurdle this afternoon by getting out of the Budget Committee. Now, they are trying to get a vote onto the Senate floor by this Thursday. So tonight, we're going to take a look at the Republican tax bills from a couple of different angles. In a few minutes, we'll take a look at the politics of it all. If Republicans can't ram this thing through, at the end of the year, they're going to have zero major legislative accomplishments, even though they control the Congress and the White House. But the president, he is more than confident that they're going to get the job done. Here he is just a couple hours ago.
We're in a very good position in terms of the meeting we just had over at the Capitol with the Republican senators. It was outstanding. I think we have tremendous support. I was just informed by Mitch that we had a unanimous vote from the Republican side, at least. We had a unanimous vote on the tax bill.
Okay, so we'll get to the politics, but first we begin with taking a look what's actually in these bills. Who's going to benefit? Who's going to get the shaft? Our senior political correspondent, Andrew Whitman, he's been breaking down the numbers today, and he joins us. And let's start first with the lower and the middle class, because at the onset of this, they were the people that the president promised would be the big winners.
Yeah, and the GOP has been saying that they're going to get a tax cut, which is both true and false. There will be a tax cut, albeit a small one that doesn't last, and it could very well be offset by other expenses. Now, here's the chart we've been using for some time, showing the impact of the tax cuts in 2027. That's the final year included in the tax forecasts. By that point, all of the benefits go to people making six figures or more, and everyone who makes less will pay more in taxes than they do now. But here's a look at the tax changes for a family earning $59,000 a year next year under the bill. Those families will get a tax cut, over the life of the bill. Those families would get a tax cut for a few years. You see the first 3 or 4 years of this plan on the left side of your screen, but eventually, as the bill continues, they would wind up paying more in taxes. That's because the Republican plan is front-loaded with more benefits early on, in part to make the bill more palatable politically. And that changes because any tax bill done under reconciliation, that's the process that lets the GOP pass this bill with only 50 votes, can only add so much to the deficit to qualify, which is why the bill's tax benefits for lower and middle income Americans expires. But whatever tax savings people in the middle and lower classes get would likely be eroded by health care costs. Now, some of that expense is easy to explain, like your premiums are going to go up if the individual mandate is repealed, and that's part of this tax bill. Some of that, though, is harder to explain, like the tax credits that lower income Americans can qualify for until they drop their insurance. So, you know, when you hear Republicans advertising that there will be a tax cut for all Americans, that's true, but it doesn't necessarily mean the total amount that somebody in the middle or lower class spends out of pocket every year will actually be less.
I saw a real interesting chart, Andrew, which is, let's say you take households 75,000 and less, or even up to 100,000 and less, especially if you have a couple earners in the household. A lot of people are going to get tax cuts, some people aren't. And I know you're going to break this down even further, but it depends on a couple things. It depends on what year we're in, because for the next couple of years, it's going to be better than it will be for the balance of the 8 years going forward.
Just to get us through the 2020 election.
It's going to be a whole lot worse than it is in 2017, for example. The other thing is geography. And unfortunately for the people watching us tonight and a few other states in this country, they don't do so good.
Yeah, we've talked a lot about this in the last couple of weeks, and that's the property tax exemption, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. But under current law, whatever you spend in property taxes on your state and local property taxes, you can deduct from your federal tax forms. The Republican bill in Congress would eliminate that deduction. So whatever that savings that you would have otherwise had will now be an out-of-pocket expense. You don't get the money back from the federal government, or at least you can't deduct that from your taxes. That's why every Republican from our area voted against the tax proposal in the House of Representatives.
And the more details that come out, it's not just New York, New Jersey, and California. We're finding out a whole host of states, including battleground states, if we're going to talk politics like we will next segment, in Ohio, in Michigan, in Wisconsin.
Yeah,
people are going to feel the pain, and like we said, maybe not the first 12 or 24 months, but over the lifetime of this, and that's where this also gets complicated.
Well, that property tax deduction is universal. It applies to every state in the country. The reason so many people focus on New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, and California is because our property tax rates tend to be higher than around the rest of the nation, so it's a bigger loss for people out of their pockets.
So I know everybody, we're talking complicated, a lot of numbers thrown at you, but let's try to bottom line some of this. So let's get some examples of who the losers are out of this, specifically out of the plan and why. And we said variables, geography, and also timeline.
Yeah, but I want to keep this as big picture for everybody as I can, Rich. And we're going to look past the tax rates that we've been talking about for weeks now and about what the actual tax rate will be. The losers include property tax owners, as we discussed, who would lose their local property tax deductions. Among the losers also would be people with high medical bills, as the medical expense deduction would be eliminated. Student loan deductions would be gone, so students and their families would lose out. So would farmers, as price supports and other programs that are aimed at helping them would be cut. Elderly and low-income Americans would be stung by the loss of the commodity assistance program. Even cuts to the affordable housing program would make affordable housing less affordable. And that's just some examples that we were able to find that are easy for people to digest.
And that's what I think is getting lost in this rush to get something through. It's not just what your income taxes are in your state and where you're going to get cut, and this idea that you have 7 brackets, we'll cut it down to 4. But it's all those other things that if you're in, not just the bottom, I'm not talking under the poverty level, I'm talking lower middle class and middle class, all of a sudden things that you're going to go to your accountant and say, wait a minute, I had that as a deduction last year. What happened to it?
It's as confusing as April 15th is for people when they're paying their taxes. Studying these tax changes is equally confusing.
In a perverse way, it's going to be more complicated filing returns now, and the idea that this was going to simplify it, not so much.
But we're attuned to looking at that number and finding out what's my income tax rate, and if it's lower than it is right now, well, then I'm doing better, right? Not necessarily with all of those different programs, and there are secondary impacts as well. There are programs that when they lose money will impact and make the cost of living more expensive for people.
So we're talking $1.5 trillion that these tax cuts would amount to over the lifetime of it, Andrew. So while some people clearly were identified that are losers, and it really looks like the ones that can least afford it, clearly somebody's winning here.
Well, and let's boil this all down, Rich. The wealthy win, and they win in this tax plan in a lot of different ways. On straight up tax rates, the wealthy win on lower rates, cuts on pass-through income, and corporate tax cuts, since wealthier Americans have more money in stocks and they get more money in corporate dividends, and both of those get boosts when the corporate tax rate is cut, as is part of this plan. The children of the wealthy will win thanks to the elimination of the estate tax. And you tell me who wins from these specific targeted tax breaks for, among other things, private jet owners, real estate developers, and golf course developers, all of which have specific tax breaks in the GOP. Just take a guess if you think that sounds like anybody you've heard of before. Finally, and this one's weird, presidential appointees win in all of this. This gets a little complicated, but a ProPublica analysis shows a tax break for appointees who have to sell their assets when they take on appointments to things like the president's cabinet. It's connected to the estate tax, but it would essentially untax some of the profits that were made when the Steve Mnuchins, the Rex Tillerson, and the Gary Cohns of the world sell off their assets in order to comply with ethics laws. Now, that theoretically wouldn't just apply to Trump appointees, and there you see the report from ProPublica. It would also theoretically apply to a Democratic president's appointees, but you really do get the sense that some of this was catered very specifically.
And more broadly, though, those in the 1%, which clearly the top 1% are the biggest beneficiaries of it, and we've seen historically in this country, and this isn't debatable, the gap between have and have-nots, we've never seen this. You go even back before the Depression started, we've never seen a widening of it like we are now. This is only going to exacerbate it. And to that end, Andrew, businesses, even more than the corporate owners, are going to be the ones that get the biggest pass here.
Well, they are, and we're hearing, look, most people, when they think businesses, they think mega multinational corporations, Microsoft or Apple or something like that. But you really need to re-examine what we mean by small businesses, because a lot of Republicans have been complaining about the impact on small businesses. And Most people think of like mom and pop stores or even professional offices like a doctor's or lawyers, but there are also businesses formed as S corps and LLCs, companies that don't pay taxes as companies, but rather taxes their owners at individual rates. Companies that include the Trump Organization and Koch Industries. Not exactly small businesses, except on paper. And a lot of Republicans say they want bigger tax cuts for the pass-throughs, and that's another term that's been getting bandied around a lot lately. The pass-through is the rate that you pay as an individual when you take the money out of the corporation.
Okay, so some people at home, and we can have a good debate about this, and I'm not even saying you're completely crazy one way or the other. They may say certain taxes are unfair. For example, I break with a lot of people on the left who say, oh my God, you can't cut the corporate tax rate. 35% is a big number compared to a lot of other, certainly even our allies. Okay, but the estate tax, right now, as a couple, as a household, if you inherit $11 million or less, you don't pay a penny in taxes. So you're only eliminating it, are only going to be helping basically 5,000 families. So all the arguments is for the small farms, don't buy it. Now here's the other argument. Hey, you cut all these taxes, you're going to grow the economy. Every nonpartisan assessment of this says it will grow the GDP in this country between 0.5% and less than 1%. But it's going to rack up a ton of debts. Now, here's the thing that nobody's really talking about yet. The deficit hawks. Remember, Republicans tend to be the party to say they're more concerned about deficits than anybody. They want triggers or backstops. You're going to hear those two words quite a bit in the next few weeks. What that means is, if the revenues don't come in, and nobody thinks they're going to, nobody believes the president's number or 4 or 5% growth, then all of a sudden Republicans say, whoa, we signed into law, we're going to have triggers. So that's going to mean there's going to be tax hikes. And who do you think they're going to ask to pay more money? Not the same 1% that are getting the break now. Then you're going to have cuts. Which programs do you think are going to be cut to try and make the pot right? So for me, the biggest issue isn't the gigantic giveaway that Andrew very well articulated. It's who's going to have to pay for it. And who's not going to pay for it in the next 2 years or 3 years before the next presidential election. It's after that. And that's why this thing isn't just, in my eyes, unfair. It is a hot mess that is going to be much worse as we go down, let alone 13 million people are going to lose in health insurance, and you're also cutting out more than $1 trillion in terms of revenue. So you add all those numbers up, I defy anybody to say this is a good deal for the country. But when we come back, we're going to break this down and take a look at the politics of this here. If Republicans strike out, they're going to go an entire year here, even though they run just about everything in D.C. without any big victories to show for it. What will they do next? Or will they say, let's hold our nose and vote for this thing, even if we know it's not great policy? We'll be right back.